I think that when you're looking at scenarios, we have to think about the writing and the purpose and the audience, and that all of those things do have to be in place. And then you can use the multimedia to provide feedback and context to help bring your scenario to life.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are and wherever you're watching from. My name is Matt Pierce, host of the Visual Lounge, and today we're going to be talking about multimedia. And you might be saying, multimedia, not video? Well, there's lots of things that go into multimedia, and that's great. We're going to be talking about what you need to think about before you create that multimedia and some things that you can consider as it goes into it. And we've got a great guest here to help us today, so let me go ahead and introduce her. Christy Tucker is a learning experience design consultant with over 20 years of experience helping people learn. She specializes in using scenario-based learning to engage audiences and promote skill transfer to real-world environments. She has created training for a wide range of clients, including Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit associations, state and local government agencies, universities, and more. Christy has been blogging about instructional design and e-learning for over 15 years and is a regular speaker at industry conferences and events. And she is awesome because she plays Dungeons & Dragons. So please help welcome Christy Tucker to the Visual Lounge. Hi, Christy. How are you today?
I'm great, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
I'm so excited to have you on. You've been on my list to have on the show for a long time. And I think this is going to be an exciting topic because there's a lot that goes into multimedia, and you are such a great writer. I'm excited to glean whatever I can from you today. But before we jump into that topic, we always ask our guests one question, which is, if you could give the audience a tip about using visuals or video, what's the one tip you would give everybody?
I would say in scenarios in particular, which is, of course, my focus, to make sure that your representation of characters reflects the diversity of your audience, plus perhaps a bit of aspirational diversity. I think that that's a really important thing about making sure that people see themselves in your scenarios.
Yeah, I love that because I do think when I look at content, if I can't feel connected to it, I tend to tune out a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Christy, let's talk about multimedia. Let's start high level. Like you said, you're someone that creates a lot of, in your bio, it talks about creating this kind of like scenario-based learning. If someone came to you and said, Christy, I'm interested in doing more multimedia type production, I'm interested in maybe some scenario-based stuff, how do you get started in that? Like, what's the basic things people need to consider to do a job that would be good at that?
So I think with scenarios in particular, you have to think about what are you doing with the multimedia? Why is it there and what is it contributing? Because I think that in scenarios, you are doing some different things with your multimedia. So now, one truth about multimedia and scenarios is that no amount of great multimedia will make up for poor writing, or if you don't have your audience right, it's just not going to work right. So it's not going to have the impact. No, so we still have to, do the good writing, have good choices, have it geared toward the right audience, and have it be relevant and authentic to their work. But the multimedia can add a lot. So we have to think about, why are we doing it? Because you could do a scenario with just text. But the multimedia often ends up giving you part of the feedback within a scenario. We have in scenarios different types of feedback. Ruth Clark, in her book on scenario-based e-learning, calls it intrinsic feedback and instructional feedback. Intrinsic feedback is the stuff that happens as a consequence of your choices in a scenario, especially like a branching scenario, an interactive scenario. The instructional feedback is the coaching, well, you picked a closed question here and got a yes or no answer, and if you'd asked an open-ended question, you would have gotten more information. That instructional feedback, that coaching. But if you're talking to a customer or a patient or an angry coworker in your scenario, their body language is part of your feedback. That is part of the consequences. And that's part of what multimedia does, is it gives you that more subtle feedback. It's not the sorry, that's incorrect that we do in a lot of e-learning. It's that subtle feedback. And that's one of the big purposes of multimedia in scenarios, is in providing that intrinsic feedback.
Yeah, well, I love that perspective because I know there's lots of those subtle things that you can show, but to add into writing would either be clunky exposition or just not helpful, or maybe hard for someone to imagine if they don't know exactly, they can't picture it in their own mind. So I do love that. I want to go down the path of writing for a little bit here because, I think writing is one of those things that there objectively is good writing and there's bad writing. But sometimes, even for myself, sometimes I'm like, I don't know where I'm at. Is this good writing or is this bad writing? And I've done both. I've done plenty of both. I'm curious for you, what would you say about what are some keys particularly in this kind of, we're writing for multimedia, maybe scenarios, what are some keys to make it good writing versus bad writing?
Okay. So I think a couple of things for, especially with scenarios again, I think that one of the things is making sure that you do understand your audience and what problems they face and what their environment looks like. Because when you're writing dialogue, you want it to sound mostly realistic. You don't want to write exactly how people talk, but more like how people talk. So more conversational. I find often that I need more contractions than looks right to me on the page, especially if I'm writing for voiceover. When you write for voiceover, we speak with contractions all the time, and you need a lot of them to sound conversational. You need a variety of sentence lengths. You need some shorter sentences. You need to have that dialogue and that back and forth between characters. I think that one of the principles of good writing is the idea of show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of telling people, writing a whole paragraph about the character's motivation, like explicitly saying that, oh, this manager is feeling really nervous because she's recently been promoted and this is her first time managing people and she's uncomfortable giving feedback, that you show that you show her being a little bit nervous in her body language as she is getting ready for this meeting to give critical feedback to somebody that she supervises, or that you show it in what happens. That's often the difference for bad writing in a story, is that there's too much describing what happens rather than showing what happens. And so thinking about that audience and then showing it. And I think, again, this is where the multimedia also will come in, because it is are there pieces of this that are faster for you to show with an image, with a video, than with dialogue or with a text description?
Yeah. Well, it seems like, particularly in that scenario, like where you've got this nervous manager, it is easy as a new writer or maybe an experienced writer. I'll say it is easy to say, like, I want him to do this, but in real life, no one's going around saying, well, I'm nervous because I'm a new manager, right? Like
Right.
that doesn't happen. But so from a practice standpoint, let's say, I want to get good at this. I want to really hone the craft here. As a mentor, if you were so kind to take me on as a mentor, what practices, advice, what could I do? Like, as someone who's listening and saying, like, well, that sounds great. I would love to be better at that, but I'm not sure how to get better at that, because that is a skill. It's a skill we need to learn.
Yeah, it is a skill. So I think when I teach branching scenarios, we start out by we figure out the goal for the branching scenario, really try to narrow it down to something very specific. I have questions that I talk to SMEs to find out, make sure we're understanding the mistakes, the consequences, not just the good things, but all of the bad things. And then thinking about your protagonist, even in a scenario, if that's a you are the manager doing this, that you still need to think about how do you signal that. So thinking about the character, thinking about the context in which things happen, how do you signal it? Thinking about the challenges that your character faces and how do they respond to that? And thinking about the consequences of their actions. In branching scenarios, I think it's also really critical to try to map some of that out before you start writing. What I have found in teaching people how to write branching scenarios, especially at the beginning, if you just sit down and try to write your first branching scenario without having mapped it out, I find that people often get stuck and have a really hard time getting through it. But if you map out the structure, if you think through, well, what are the decision points that I want? Where are the places that people get stuck in this, where I need them to practice making a decision and giving them realistic choices? If you have that, it's just like writing from an outline, except it's the nonlinear version of that. It's much easier if you have some structure to write into because you know what the next piece is. And that's fundamentally one of the things for if you're just getting started, trying to map out some structure and then write into it is part of how you get better at it. The other piece I think for writing dialogue is to read it aloud. Because fundamentally, you get better at scripts when you read them aloud and you hear them.
Yeah. I have learned that lesson that you always read it aloud. I've also realized that early on, particularly when I was a lot less experienced at creating video content, I realized that I often wanted a scenario, if I was telling a story or something like that, I would try to go like from A to X, right? But I wanted to show everything along the way. And it feels like in good storytelling, you know what to leave out. Like, you know, in a good scenario, like you don't have to show that the full meeting. You don't need to show 30 minutes of this back and forth meeting. Like, you could show the piece you need to show and let the learner or the viewer jump through the conclusion to the conclusion of whatever this comes next without having to show. Then they took a 30-minute break and then they went to lunch and then, but that was a hard lesson for me. So do you think do you see people struggle with that idea that they got to kind of fill out the whole thing and maybe not leave things to imagination?
Yeah. I mean, we'll say the advice of, oh, you should write how people talk, except if you write too accurately to how people talk, it's really boring because we start out every conversation with the little bits of some small talk and getting into things. And the reality is that most of the time we should not have those greetings and that small talk and the, like, can you see my screen? Like that shouldn't be, part of our scenarios. Most of the time we should jump ahead. And I think even though the show don't tell is a rule, you can also show too much when sometimes the actual thing should be that you should have a little transition that says 30 minutes later and you've jumped ahead in time so that you're showing the really key part of the action. Sometimes you have to write those things, those interim parts of it. You need to write it for yourself to like know what's going on. You might write down like that manager, that nervous manager's motivation, you might have written down on a sheet of paper someplace for yourself in your planning, as long as you don't put that paragraph into the scenario. For the learners, like it is helpful sometimes for me like to know that I will sometimes think about a character's backstory as I'm writing it. Yeah. But also I don't need to have that much in there. I think one of the other traps that people get into with branching scenarios, especially at the beginning, is trying to do too much in a single scenario. You are much better off doing a series of shorter scenarios, especially when you're starting out, than to try to do all the things one scenario to rule them all. Like that's like, don't try to do a 45-minute scenario that has 200 different endings. I mean, heck, I have a scenario that has 15 different endings, and honestly, it's too much, and I need to actually go back and redo it. It's one of my it's one that I did over 10 years ago, and I went back to it, and I'm like, why was I so inefficient in this? I should have collapsed a bunch of these endings together. Like, this was like, this was really dumb how I did this, and I wasted a lot of effort on things that I should have simplified for myself. And right, so you try to do too much in it. So narrowing it down, generally speaking, it makes the branching structure easier. It makes the writing easier. It makes it easier to keep your multimedia, consistent, and you don't have as much to do. It makes all of the things more manageable if you focus it a lot right at the very beginning of the process.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you talked about towards the beginning about audience. And we've talked a
Mhm.
little bit about understanding your audience. I know you work with a lot of different organizations to probably you're multi-streaming across different kind of projects or whatever like that. And it seems to me that even internally, sometimes it's really hard to maybe gauge. Like, I know our personas, I know the audience, but like for you, as someone who's working across these things, what advice do you have about really being able to nail that audience? Because it seems like you gotta have a good script, but the linchpin might be if it's got to be the right script for that audience. So, any
Right.
advice you could give us?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, we would all interview learners as part of our analysis.
Ideally,
Um,
ideally.
Ideally, like that would be part of it, right? We're not just interviewing the SMEs and the stakeholders. And it's great when I have that opportunity because sometimes I do. But I'm an external consultant who works with a bunch of different organizations on different timelines, and I do not always have access. And so sometimes it is that we have to take what the SMEs give us, and we do have to ask the questions. Well, where do people get stuck in this? When you learned this, what was confusing to you? Um, Figuring out where those problems are does help in understanding where the pain points are for the audience. And that's part of that analysis. One other little trick, especially if it's sort of general roles of things, of like if you're doing sort of customer service things and if you've never worked in a call center, you maybe don't know what that environment's like. But on Reddit, you can find people complaining about what it's like to work in a customer service, or you can, find managers or, coworker stories or retail stories or whatever, right? You can find those stories online. And I do actually find it helpful to read some of these. Okay, like obviously on Reddit, you should always assume that people are exaggerating stories, and there's a certain amount of like people are making up stories for clout on Reddit. But also, like, you can get some real things about, like, well, what are the things that people get annoyed about? Or, you know, looking at where those people hang out, wherever it is, and listening to some real stories, even if you can't get access to your exact learners, finding the stories of people who are similar can help a lot in getting the language right and getting some of those little details right. So I think that that's one of those tips that I think helps quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I love that because yeah, I mean, I don't know what everybody's environment's like, but if I can't go to it, at least there's a source. And great tip on Reddit, like, but I think even just but hearing those stories, right? Like hearing the things that are troubling or whatever, and your I'm guessing your clients will say, "Oh no, that's not what we're like. We're not that bad," or whatever. But at least gives you the flair of what people are dealing with. So sounds like great advice.
Yeah, I mean, you don't use those stories exactly as per, like you don't use it exactly as written. You take little bits of it and, little bits from here and there. I have one client right now where I've got recordings from Zoom conversations with teams where they are brainstorming some problems and stuff. So I don't get to interview those people directly, but I am listening to them talk about their problems. And honestly, that's been really useful to me. So I'm getting it from more directly from their audience. So I think, anything you do to take those pieces of it, of those stories, and honestly, sometimes in a scenario you're going to make something up. Like you do your research, you talk to the people that you have access to, and then you make your best guess and you write it in there, and then you let them tell you if you're wrong or not when you do the reviews.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just your imagination too.
Yeah, it reminds me of very early in my life as an instructional designer. I was still in grad school and I was doing work for a company, and we went to, of all places, Hamburger U. If you don't know Hamburger U, it's McDonald's headquarters. The company I was working for had a job there, and it was really interesting because they brought in like this was like probably an ethics training. I don't remember exactly what the training was, but they brought in these leaders and they told stories. And I remember particularly one of them, and I won't go into all the details, but like, she grew up started as a, fry cook, went in, ended up in leadership in this South American country where she was from. And like, just, yeah. So it's incredible when you have that detail, the richness that it added to
Mhm.
the scenarios that we're building. So I really appreciate that. Well, Christy, as we're kind of moving through here, are there any last pieces of advice you would want to give us about writing good multimedia scenarios before we move into our speed round questions?
So I think I do want to talk a little bit about multimedia specifically because I do
Yeah.
think because I've talked a lot about the writing and other pieces. So I think one of the things that we can think about is, when is it worth doing images and video for scenarios? And one of the things is that, especially if you're doing soft skills training, or we're in the real environment where they would have to be reacting to people's facial expressions or reacting to tone of voice, those are the times that it is worthwhile to put together the multimedia. Whether that is the images of a character with different expressions, and you're using that again as that intrinsic feedback, whether that is actual video. I have done interactive video where we've hired actors and done those things because we were teaching really in-depth soft skills where they needed to handle challenging conversations, and the body language is so much of that. Um, so you think about what other pieces of it you can show, and that the multimedia is also part of setting the context to make it look like whatever their environment's going to be. So we know that people transfer learning to their work environment if the way that they practice that environment signals them the way that their work environment does, the more similar your practice is to your work environment. So if you have the signals of the right kind of equipment in the background, or
Mm.
the right kind of office setting, is it cubicles or is it open offices, or is it a dentist office versus a medical office, is not the same context, and having it in the right one helps your learners actually retain the information better. And you can do that through the multimedia.
Yeah. What that's great advice, because I think we sometimes forget, like we think, oh, we'll just sub in whatever space we have, even though it doesn't feel, yeah, I want to feel like hey, that relates to me because that's in my
Mhm.
type of space. Awesome. Awesome. Well, Christy, this has been a fantastic conversation. Excited to take and apply some of the things I've learned today. I do want to move us into our speed round questions. These are fast, quick answers determined by the roll of a dice. So we're going to play our little stinger here, and here we go. All right, we're going to go over to the dice tower, Christy, and I know you're no stranger to. Do you have a favorite die that you like? Are you D12, D10, D8, D7, or D6?
I do have my, because I've done a lot of D&D and we're doing some Pathfinder these days. I did Dragonbane last night, but it's all D20s
All
mostly.
right,
So
perfect.
yeah.
Well, I need to come up with a few more questions to get that D20 going, but look at that, a 12, the highest roll we can get. So that's pretty good. So here's a question for you. What's your one go-to tool that helps you get your job done on a regular basis? Now, this could be software, it could be hardware, it could be physical, whatever it is that however you want to define tool. What's that one go-to tool?
I will say I'm using Poe quite a bit right now. Poe is an AI aggregator tool that has Claude for writing, it has Flux for image generation, it has 11 Labs for voiceover. So, and also has access to ChatGPT and Gemini and Copilot and Dolly and Runway and a bunch of other things. So I'm using it for a bunch of different little things and experimenting right now.
Very cool. I mean, AI is a thing, and I think you've got to be experimenting to stay up on top of
Mm-hmm.
it. So, all right, next question. Here we go. It is an 8. So question 8 is, where do you turn for inspiration? Obviously, you're writing a lot of scenarios. That's a creative work. So where do you get inspiration from in your day-to-day?
I read a lot of fiction and fantasy. I do try to read every night. And so I think that reading for fun is also part of how you learn how to be a better writer.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of great books out right now. So
Mhm.
so many good things. All right. Last one is, I'm going to ask you 6 or 9. Can you tell?
It looks like that's a 9 based on where the dot is.
It's perfect. I usually have to explain what that's what it is. So number 9. Okay. What's the one you've done a lot? You've been a consultant on your own for a while now, but what's the one thing you're most proud of in your career?
Ooh. I will say the first one that jumps to mind is actually from when I was working full time. I did a course on cultural competence for teachers. It was a graduate course. And in the pilot from that, in the surveys, that we hit a surprisingly high number of teachers who felt that the course was really transformative and that really did make them want to go back and rethink their whole curriculum, and that class had so much impact on the people who went through it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's real. Like, you're getting people to think, you're getting people to change. Oh, good stuff. Oh, way to go. Okay, Christy, we're towards the end. So if anyone wanted to work with you, they wanted to maybe hire you to do some creative work with their scenarios based, where can they reach you?
Easiest place to find me is on my blog, which is christytuckerlearning.com. And I have a whole page with a collection of posts on storytelling and scenarios. And that's the place to start. My company name is Cinead Learning, and I do have a separate company page and portfolio there as well.
All right. All right. Well, Christy, as we wrap up today, what would you say is your final take?
I think that when you're looking at scenarios, we have to think about the writing and the purpose and the audience, and that all of those things do have to be in place. And then you can use the multimedia to provide feedback and context to help bring your scenario to life.
Perfect. Well, Christy, thank you so much for joining me in the Visual Lounge.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. All right, everybody. This is why I love talking to people, because I learn so much, but particularly when you think about multimedia, you think about video, right? From a text message perspective, you probably think about like, oh, we're going to do a screen recording. We're going to make a tutorial, like a how-to step ABC. And those are awesome, but there's so many things you can use images and video for to enhance the learning of your audience, of whoever you're trying to help lift and get them to be better, to take certain actions. So this is why I love talking to people like Christy, and she's fantastic. So go check out her stuff. And of course, if you like what you're hearing here, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, do all that good stuff. It helps the show get found by all the aggregators, and people then find us, and that we can do more shows, and we can do all the stuff, bring you even more guests. We want to be here for you. And of course, we want to help you in your learning journey. So we hope you take a little time to level up every single day.